Before we get to tonight's talk, I'd like to make a couple announcements and let you know where we're headed for the fall and for next week. Again, I have to always thank my great friend Arturo Machuca from the Houston Airport Systems, who manages the Houston Spaceport. He's been a great sponsor of this lecture series for a number of years, and if you've been following the newspapers, there's lots of great stuff happening down in Ellington Field, and there's more to come in the next few months, so keep your eye out on that. We will have a functioning spaceport doing cool stuff pretty soon. The other thing is, just want to give you a couple of heads up about events that are coming up. Most of you, I think, are on our mailing list. If you're not, please write to us and we'll make sure you're on it. We have an RSI members mailing list, and we also have our Spaceport Frontiers mailing list. These kind of grew independently, and we're going to at some point try and at least put some of those aspects together. Next Friday, April 12, which is Yuri's night, we will be having the NASA Administrator, Jim Bridenstine. I think it was 97, he's a Rice Owl. And he'll be coming and giving a conversation with NASA Administrator. So hopefully you've seen that message. Right now it's slated to be in this room at the same time as usual. If for some reason we get a larger than usual response, that's why we're encouraging everybody to RSVP right now. There's no tickets, it just gives us a head count, and if it turns out we've got too many for this room, we might try and find another auditorium, which at Rice is very difficult. Anyway, please pay attention to that. A very early heads up, and you'll forget all of this until we send you the reminders, is in September 12th, which will be the 57th anniversary of President Kennedy's speech at the Rice Stadium. We've been working with the Kennedy Library and the Foundation and the University Space Research Association to host an event discussing the legacy of Kennedy, what's happening in space. You might see this guy again. So that's something just to put on your radar for September 12th. The other thing, I'd like to thank the Abbey family, which is large and prosperous. It's great to see them. I've interacted with a few of them over the years. It's nice to see, especially the younger generation and the scientists among them here tonight. And you can find out all about them when you buy and read the book, The Astronaut Maker. There's some interesting family stories in there. And then before, again, we get started, we have an Apollo 7 astronaut in the room, Walt Cunningham, if you don't mind Walt saying hello. And his lovely wife, Dot, who's sitting right beside him. So thank you for joining tonight, too. There's also a few sort of well-kent faces, as we say in Scotland, from NASA in the room. I'm sure they'll make themselves known, people like Mark Craig, and then a few of the younger guys, too. Okay, so normally what I would do is I'd pick out this piece of paper and read the biography of our speaker. I decided not to do that tonight, partly because you've all bought the book, so you'll learn more than I could tell you. And it is on the website and on the poster. But I think, and the reason why I didn't want to do all of that is because I've already talked long enough and we don't have time. And the only word really to describe tonight's speaker when it comes to space is a legend. I mean, the man, as you get to know him and what he's done in his career and his life, is just absolutely astounding. And we wouldn't be here talking in Houston talking about space program in large part if it wasn't for George Abbey. So I think that's as much as I can say that is, it's heartfelt and what he has done for what we're all interested in. And personally, in the last maybe 8 or 9 years, I've been working closely with George. He helps whenever he can. I have some stupid idea, and he picks up the phone, and next thing you know, you're talking to the head of the Russian Space Agency. So he's been really, really helpful to us at Rice, and particularly us at the Rice Space Institute. And so that's a personal thanks just for everything that you do for us as well as the community. So, please join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Mr. George Abbey, the astronaut maker.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you all for coming this evening. I thought I might reflect a little bit on the past this evening, looking at our ongoing space activities and some uncertainty relative to our future activities. I think there's a lesson to be learned looking at the past, and in that this the 50th anniversary of Apollo, and I think Apollo was probably a good place to start and a good place to talk about how it was accomplished and how it was done. It really got started about 62 years ago this October when the Soviet Union launched a satellite, and that was on October 4th of 1957. And that got the attention of the Western world and certainly got the attention of the United States, because if the Soviet Union had that kind of capability, they could certainly launch ICBMs and cause some great destruction. So with that event, the United States really put a great deal of effort into engineering, getting more students into engineering and science. They made an investment, a substantial investment in that, and the country's been living off that investment probably for the last 50 years. But over and above that, they decided that they would focus the space activities and try to get them all in one agency, and they formed NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, a year later in October of 1958. And in December of that year, NASA started a manned spaceflight program to put an astronaut into orbit. And of course, the Russians, during that time period, had also been doing a great deal. They've been flying animals and even flew a dog that gave birth to a puppy that gave one of the puppies to the President of the United States. And they continue to accomplish great things in space. And in 1960, we had an election. And in 1961, we had a new president come in, John F. Kennedy. And he came in January, and with a lot of promise about he would change things and make things for the better. There was at that time it was called a missile gap. We were behind the Soviet Union, and he was going to fix that. And there was great promise with this new administration. Well, that went on for a few months, and then after about 3 months, an event occurred that really electrified the world again. The Soviet Union launched a human in space, Yuri Gagarin, on April 12th of 1961. And the Sputnik, the launch of the satellite, had gotten everybody's attention, but certainly launching Yuri Gagarin even caused more of a consternation. And then about 5 days later, 6 days later, there was a invasion of Cuba that didn't go well. And with those two events, the president was greatly concerned and greatly embarrassed that his administration had gotten off to a start that was not good. And in late April, they had formed a Space Council when they formed NASA, and the president was the head of the Space Council. But in April, late April, he asked the Congress to make the vice president head of the Space Council. So Lyndon Johnson was made head of the Space Council. And President Kennedy asked Lyndon Johnson and the Space Council to come up with a recommendation of a program that would at least give us a 50-50 chance of beating the Soviet Union before they did it. And on May 5th of 1961, we launched our first astronaut in space, Alan Shepard. He didn't go into orbit. He went up about 116 miles and went downrange at the Kennedy Space Center and landed in the water about 302 miles downrange. But that was at least a start. And so on May 8th, the Vice President made a recommendation to John F. Kennedy that we ought to go to the moon and return astronauts safely back to Earth. And on May 25th, 3 weeks after Alan Shepard flew, President Kennedy went to the Congress and he made a quite long speech. It covered a lot of different topics. And right at the end of the speech, he made the comment about the space program. And he said that he was going to start a program that would go to the moon and return astronauts safely to the Earth and do it by the end of the decade. And there was a lot of silence in the audience, and then finally there was great applause. And that was the start of the Apollo program. It got underway at that time. even though its heritage went back to the days of Sputnik. But at that point, NASA did not really know how they were going to do it. They just knew that we were going to go to the moon by the end of the decade. And there are a lot of different approaches to doing that. And one approach was a direct ascent to the moon with a large booster. Another approach was many launches and doing assembly in Earth orbit. But there was an engineer at Langley Research Center, which was part of NASA, named John Hubalt, and he had a concept called Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. And that wasn't getting a lot of consideration. So he wrote a letter directly to the Deputy Administrator of NASA, Bob Siemens, which was kind of out of channels, but nevertheless, he sent it to him. And that started to get attention when the Deputy Administrator looked at it. And finally, after about 9 months of study, they concluded that was the approach that we would use to go to the moon, Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, which did involve a large booster. And at that point in time, we were developing a large booster that became the Saturn V at Huntsville, Alabama. And with the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, that gave us contracts really for 2 spacecraft that were needed. A command and service module that the crew would travel back and forth to the moon in, but also a lunar module that would do the actual landing on the moon. And they would all go together in one launch vehicle. And that was the start of the program. We hadn't, at that point when Kennedy made that speech, we hadn't even flown John Glenn in orbit. He flew in orbit in February of 1962. And so we had a long ways to go before we really got to the moon. But after we had decided on the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, it was clear that we needed to really learn how to do rendezvous and dockings in space and develop the systems that we would need to do mission to the moon, the fuel cells and the other systems. So Mercury was still going on, and we started another program called Gemini. And Gemini was really a crucial activity because that was really the pathway to get to the moon, and we would not have been successful in Apollo had we not done that. The Mercury program continued to fly, and it flew the first flight in 1961, and it flew its last flight, 6 manned flights, in 1963. And then Gemini started flying in March of '65, and its last flight was flown in November 1966. And it was a very successful program. We flew 10 manned missions in Earth orbit. And we were able to not only do rendezvous and dockings, but we were able to really extend the time we had stayed in space by a much longer period of time, at least equal to a mission to the moon. Gordon Cooper had flown the last Mercury flight, which was the longest flight we had flown up till that point in time, and that was just 1 day and about 10 hours. So Gemini was a critical activity. And all during that time when Mercury and Gemini were really going on, we were working on the Apollo program. And so Gemini ended in November 1966, and the first Apollo mission was scheduled to fly in February 1967. Let's see. And this is the crew of the first mission. It was Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. And they were scheduled to fly, as I say, in February of 1967. And they had completed their training, and the spacecraft was at the Cape, and all was in preparation for their flight. This is the 3 astronauts. And that's a picture of their spacecraft, and this is a picture of the spacecraft on the pad. And usually about a month before we do a launch, we do a countdown demonstration test, which is really a rehearsal of the whole launch. And so in January of 1967, on the 27th of January, they were doing a countdown demonstration test with the crew on board the vehicle. And in fact, Walt Cunningham, who was in the backup crew, was there at the Cape and had been working with the crew all during that preparation time. and had reviewed the test procedures the night before. And so the crew was in the spacecraft, and we had the hatch closed, and we had 100% oxygen in the spacecraft because we were flying with 100% oxygen. And there were a lot of flammable materials in the spacecraft, nylon, Velcro, and other flammable materials. And unfortunately, in those days, we didn't really take as much care going in and out of the spacecraft and working in the crew cabin as we should have. And the workers, I think, in the process of working inside, had damaged the wiring. And so we had a spark, and the spark ignited the nylon, and we had a fire inside the spacecraft. At that point in time, we had an inward opening hatch, and the crew couldn't get the hatch open. And unfortunately, we lost all 3 astronauts. They didn't burn to death, but they were asphyxiated by the smoke. But that was a great tragedy that we had to recover from. And we had to understand what caused the fire. And then we had to go ahead and identify the cause and fix it. And then really come up with a lot of non-flammable materials that would not burn in oxygen. And that was a tremendous task, trying to do that, to come up with materials that didn't burn, and then test them and prove that they didn't burn, and then fabricate everything that we would need inside the cabin, the suits and everything that would be made out of the non-flammable material. And we were successful doing that. And it took a good bit of time. And all those materials we developed, they benefit people here on Earth right now. They're in all the airliners that we fly. They're in pajamas for a lot of young people. And they're used in all kinds of applications, in racing cars and other dangerous applications. So it's been a great benefit. But we did get all that done, and we redesigned the hatch. We made it into a quick opening hatch that worked very well. And for those of you that go out to Space Center Houston or have been to Space Center Houston, you can see one of the command modules out there, the last one that we took to the moon, and see that hatch. And it turned out to be a great design. And we also changed a lot of the systems in the spacecraft, improved them, and got more reliability. And then we felt after going through all that, we were ready to fly. And Walt and his 2 crewmates were in that crew. And that's Walt's patch right there. And there's Walt right there. You can recognize him, I'm sure. But this mission was really a critical mission, because the program manager, George Lowe, who I worked for, I was fortunate to work for, a great leader and an individual of great vision and a great mentor, had taken a vacation in that September before the flight that was scheduled in October. And he came back from that vacation. He'd been working 7 days a week ever since the fire. But he came back with a new idea. He said that if we continued on the present course, or the planned missions, that we were not going to get to the moon by the end of the decade. So he came up with a very bold plan that said if Apollo 7 was a successful mission, and Apollo 7 recognized it was the first flight of the Apollo spacecraft. If that mission was successful, that would open the way to do a flight 2 months later to go to the moon, the second flight of the command module. And so Apollo 7 was really a critical mission for the program, and we would not have landed on the moon were not successful. So I think we owed a great debt of gratitude to Wally and Walt and Don Isley for a great mission, because it was a great mission. And George Lowe sold the leadership of NASA on his approach that if it was successful, that we'd go to the moon 2 months later. And the administrator of NASA said he didn't want to announce it till after the mission if it was successful. And it turned out to be a great success. And there's Walt being launched. And that's one of the great pictures that Walt and his crew took from orbit, which shows all of Florida and shows the launch site also. And that was a great mission. And that really opened the door for really the program to go ahead and proceed and fly the next mission to the moon. And that was 2 months after that. The crew that got assigned to that mission found out about that mission that they were going to be assigned to in September, and they flew it in December. And the other factor that went into that mission was it was going to go on a Saturn V, the large booster. And the Saturn V had only flown 2 flights. The first flight had been a very successful one, but the second flight, which occurred in April of 1968, was really a disaster because it had severe vibrations in the first stage pogo, and that caused the shutdown of 2 of the engines on the second stage. It caused the third stage engine not to restart, and that engine has to restart if you're going to go to the moon. It gives you the thrust to get out of Earth orbit to go to the moon. And the spacecraft LEM adapter, that part of the launch vehicle that surrounds the lunar module, came apart in flight. That occurred in April. So in addition to working on getting Apollo 7 ready, our friends in Huntsville, Alabama had to solve all those problems with the launch vehicle from April to December to get the Saturn V ready to fly. So after that flight of April, which was not successful, the next flight of the Saturn V was with a crew on board going to the moon. And this is a patch of the crew going to the moon, of the Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders. And there are the 3 astronauts there. And that's the launch of their spacecraft. That was in December 21st of 1968. A very short time after that Saturn V had the problem. And that's a picture taken of the Earth, the first one we ever saw, really, as they were on their way to the moon. And that is a great picture. You can see the continent of the Earth, as you look back, and that's what they saw when they looked back. And they went into orbit around the moon on Christmas Eve in 1968. This should have sound, but I don't know. Is it?
The lunar sunrise.
I'll go back. Yeah.
Now approaching lunar sunrise.
Sorry, there's 2 drivers and I'm the worst one.
And for all the people
Let's see under it.
back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like. I hope that all of you back on Earth can see what we mean when we say it's a rather foreboding horizon, a rather stark and unappetizing looking place. We're now going over, approaching one of our future landing sites, selected in this smooth region to call the Sea of Tranquility. Smooth in order to make it easy for the initial landing attempts, in order to preclude Dodge Mountains. Now you can see the long shadows of the lunar sunrise.
This is the first pictures that people on the Earth had of a close-up of the moon, taken with a television camera out the window. This was Christmas Eve of 1968.
We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
People all over the world were watching that night. It was a very emotional period, a very emotional evening. And I think is long remembered, certainly by all those that saw it that night. It was a great Christmas Eve. They came around the moon, and this is what they saw on their first orbit. And this picture has become very famous because you see the Earth out there in that void of darkness, and it becomes pretty clear that the Earth is a very fragile planet that we live on. And I think this picture has raised the sensitivity of people here on the Earth to the environment, and certainly it's an environment that we need to worry about and take care of. But so far on the two missions that we'd flown the command and service module now twice. The crew that went to the moon was just in the command and service module. We didn't take the lunar module, so they didn't have to learn to fly two spacecraft. And it was much simpler for us because we just went into lunar orbit, and we were able to check our navigation and our trajectories and our procedures, and that was really a major step forward for us. But we still had to prove the lunar module. And so the next flight was going to fly 2 months after the flight to the moon, and it was Apollo 9. And this is a crew of Apollo 9, Jim McDivitt, Dave Scott, and Rusty Schweikert. And they were going to fly on a Saturn V, and they were going to fly in Earth orbit. And we were going to check out the lunar module, the first manned lunar module mission. So this crew had to fly really two spacecraft. So the Saturn V that took this mission into space was launched with both a lunar module and a command and service module. And when they got into orbit, they were able to separate from the command service module. Two of the astronauts went over into the lunar module, and this is a picture taken by Dave Scott of the lunar module in orbit. And Rusty Schweikert and Jim McDivitt were flying it. And they separated from the command and service module by about 111 miles, and then they re-rendezvoused and docked. And they had fired, and coming back to the rendezvous and docking, they fired the ascent stage, which is the upper part of the lunar module, which is what lifts the astronaut off the surface of the Earth, and they proved that system as well. So the docking went well, and the mission went well. And at that point, we thought we would, and we also did an EVA. Rusty Schweiker did a stand-up EVA with a new spacesuit. But at that point, we thought we would be ready to do a dress rehearsal to go to the moon. So 2 months later, we flew Apollo 10. And this is the patch of Apollo 10. This is a crew, Gene Cernan, John Young, and Tom Stafford. And this mission was again on a Saturn V. It would take a lunar module to the moon with a command and service module. So the crew had to learn to fly 2 spacecraft. And the lunar module and command module would go into lunar orbit, and then they would separate in lunar orbit and make a descent. The 2 astronauts, Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan, would make a descent over the landing site that we would end up using for Apollo 11. This is the launch of Apollo 10, and that is a picture taken by John Young of the lunar module in lunar orbit. And as I say, the ascent stage was that part that is used to come up off of the moon. And so Gene Cernan and Tom Stafford flew down into low altitude over the landing site to about 40,000 feet, and then they fired the ascent engine and came back up and rendezvoused. They didn't land, but they took pictures of the landing site. They were actually too heavy to land. But the mission was very successful, and they returned safely to the Earth. And 2 months later, we thought we'd be ready to fly Apollo 11. And we were, and Apollo 11 with certainly this crew that you all know, Neil Armstrong, Mike Collins, and Buzz Aldrin. And this is their vehicle going to the pad, and this is their vehicle being launched. And that is a picture taken from the television of Neil coming down the ladder. So that was the first individual to step surface on the surface of the moon. We had a television camera that was mounted on a lunar module, so we could point it at the ladder so we could see the astronauts as they came down, and then use it to point around close to the lunar module where they were working. And this is Neil just before he stepped down on the surface of the moon. And this is a picture of Buzz by the flag that they put up on the moon. You don't see pictures, real photographs of Neil on the moon because he was carrying the camera. So the only pictures you see really are Buzz. But needless to say, this was a great mission, and we had, when we got the astronauts back, safely back home, we could say we completed really what the president had set us out to do, to land on the moon and bring the astronauts safely back to Earth by the end of the decade. And it had been a very successful 8 years. So I think at that point in time, we felt we didn't have to keep flying every 2 months. So Apollo 12 was going to be flown 4 months later. And this is a patch of the crew for Apollo 12. And this is the Apollo 12 crew, Pete Conrad, Dick Gordon, and Al Bean. And at that point in time, we had concerns about the mass concentrations on the moon affecting our navigation. So we really wanted to do a pinpoint landing of the lunar module, and we wanted to do it close to a spacecraft that had landed on the moon, a surveyor spacecraft that had landed in 1967. And on the launch of Apollo 12, we had an unfortunate mishap, though, that kind of set us back. This is a picture of the launch of Apollo 12, and we were struck by lightning. And at that point in time, the astronauts lost all their systems in the spacecraft, electrical power, and we were really in a difficult situation. But fortunately, we had a young controller in the control center, John Aaron, who had been through, during the simulations, been through an exercise where that had happened, and he relayed to the crew what switches to throw, and they regained the electrical power. And then once we got into orbit, we orbited the Earth in extra orbit to make sure everything had not been adversely affected by the lightning, and convinced ourselves that it was okay, and we launched on a trajectory to the moon. And there's Apollo 12. You can see the lunar module in the background and the surveyor spacecraft in the foreground. And that's one of the astronauts taking pieces off that surveyor that we brought back because we wanted to see what the effect of that environment was on a spacecraft sitting on the lunar surface. But it was a great mission and very successful. And we felt we could fly another mission back to the moon, Apollo 13, 4 months later. And this is the crew of Apollo 13. That individual in the middle was not the original crew of Apollo 13. That's Jack Swigert. And that's Fred Hayes and Jim Lovell on either side of Jack. Jack was added to the crew about 2 days before launch because Ken Mattingly, who was on the crew, had been exposed to measles because one of the other astronauts' children had measles, and there was a concern that Ken would come down with measles in flight. As it turned out, he didn't, but they replaced him on the crew. And Jack Swigert, who was on the backup crew, had about 1 day to do a couple runs with the prime crew and went on the prime crew with Fred and Jim. The backup crew actually goes through everything the prime crew does, and on Apollo we had backup crews to every flight. This is the launch of Apollo 13, and at that point everything was going great. And when you get into Earth orbit, you fire the third stage of the Saturn V, it takes you on a trajectory to the moon. And then you actually separate from the third stage, and the crew takes the command module and does a 180-degree turn and picks up the lunar module, which is right above the third stage, and docks with it, as you see in this picture. So they had done that. We were on a trajectory to the moon, and we had the lunar module docked with the command module. And we had just completed an in-flight press conference with the crew, and everything had gone well. And after the conference, one of the controllers asked the crew to stir the liquid oxygen tank, stir the pumps so they could get better readings on the tank. When they did that, there was an explosion in the tank, and we lost all of our oxygen, we lost our electrical power, and we had really one of our major crises, the first major crises we had in space. The only oxygen that was available really at that point was over in the lunar module, because we had oxygen there in the lunar module to use on the lunar surface. We had batteries in the lunar module, so we had power in the lunar module. So we shut down everything we could in the command module and moved the crew over to the lunar module. And they existed there throughout the mission. It was fortunate that when it occurred that we were docked and they could do that, but the lunar module, as it turned out, be a great lifeboat for us. And we had to conserve power in the lunar module because it had a limited amount of battery power because it had batteries just for the time we were on the lunar surface. But they sufficed, and we were on a trajectory at that point in time called a pre-return trajectory that went around the moon and then came back to the Earth. But we had also to do certain mid-course corrections to make sure the spacecraft, when it did come back, landed in the right place where we could recover the crew. And we couldn't use the service module engine because it had been damaged probably in the explosion, which had occurred back in the service module. So we used the lunar module in a mode that we hadn't used it in before. We used that engine to do our corrections, and we were able to do that. In the lunar module, we also had a limited number of lithium hydroxide canisters that were used to scrub the air, and we quickly ran out of those, and the only additional lithium hydroxide canisters we had were in the command module, but they didn't fit in the lunar module. And this is a picture of the crew implementing a procedure we came up with on the ground to show how we could jury-rig the lithium hydroxide canisters in the command module to make them work in the lunar module, which they were successful in doing. And as they came around back before they entered the Earth's atmosphere, they separated from the service module, they separated from the lunar module, and they went into the command module. We had enough electrical power in the batteries in the command module to give us power for entry. And as they looked at the service module, this is a picture they took after they separated, and you can see the damage in the whole section of the service module that was blown out there. So it turned out to be a successful recovery. We got the crew back, and they re-entered, and the lunar module and the service module went into the Earth's atmosphere, and I think the lunar module ended up somewhere near New Zealand. And this is the command module coming down after they came back through the Earth's atmosphere. But we had to understand before we flew again what caused that problem. And we were able to do that. We were able to identify what had gone wrong in the oxygen tank. The wiring there had been overheated because of a design error, and then also the tank had been dropped. And so we were able to identify and reproduce the accident and fix the problem. But we didn't fly again until the following January and flew Apollo 14. Now, on each of these missions, particularly after the first mission, we wanted to emphasize science, and so science got to be a high priority on a lot of these missions, and certainly by the time we were flying Apollo 13 and 14, science did take a high priority. And on 14, this is a crew of 14, Alan Shepard and Ed Mitchell and Stu Rusa. And this is a picture of their launch vehicle. We took on that mission a small cart that they would pull behind them on the lunar surface. This is a picture of the launch, and there's the lunar module on the surface. But on that mission, we did take a small cart that enabled the astronauts to put their equipment on the cart, and as they went around to different sites to pick up samples, they could put them on that cart and carry them. But at the time we were doing all these missions, we also wanted to develop another vehicle that would allow them to go further and do more. And we developed a lunar rover, a vehicle they could drive on the moon, and it was going to fly on Apollo 15, which was the next flight. And this is the crew of Apollo 15, Dave Scott, who had flown on Apollo 9, Al Warden, and Jim Irwin. And this is their launch. And this is a lunar rover that we actually put on the lunar module. It was designed and built and put on the side of the lunar module, and this shows you where it was located. And this shows you how they actually deployed it on the surface of the moon. It had wire mesh wheels, and you can see a picture of it here. And it had an antenna on it, which the astronaut could point back at the Earth, and once he pointed at the Earth, we could control that television camera, the television camera that you see on the lunar rover, and follow the astronauts wherever they went. So the lunar rover was a very successful vehicle, and it flew on Apollo 15, 16, and 17. And as I say, the science was emphasized more on each of these missions. Each of the landings was made at a different site, all 6 landings. And we put a lot of effort into really determining the optimum landing site for each mission, because we wanted to really understand the evolution of the moon and how it would related to the Earth. And each of the landings, as you can see in the background, was in a different area. We went in on the Sea of Tranquility on Apollo 11, then we went to highland areas on later flights. The next mission was Apollo 16, and at that point in time, we were flying missions 6 to 9 months apart. And this is a patch of Apollo 16, and this is the crew of Apollo 16, Charlie Duke and John Young and Ken Mattingly, who had been taken off the Apollo 13 crew. And in order to train the astronauts for driving the rover on the surface of the moon, we had a lunar rover training vehicle, and that vehicle is on display down in Space Center Houston, if you go down there and look at it. And this is that vehicle there. It had hard rubber tires, not the wire mesh wheels, but in every other respect, it was very much like the one that went on the moon. And this is a launch of Apollo 16. And that's a picture of North America that John Young took on the way to the moon. And you see, that's probably one of the best pictures we've had of North America. You can see Baja California all the way up to Seattle. And this is a picture of John Young on the surface of the moon. The moon has 1/6 gravity of the same 1/6 gravity of the Earth, so you can jump a good ways. And oh, thank you. And so this is a picture of John Young saluting the flag, but he's also jumping quite a bit, cut a ways off the Earth. And if you look at the lunar module that is on display down in Space Center Houston, you'll see the ladder that is on that lunar module. That first rung is very high, and it was high because we were very concerned about weight and cutting where we could, but the astronauts actually could jump up all the way up to that first rung easily. And this is a picture of Earthrise that was taken by John Young on Apollo 16, and the landing of Apollo 16 in the ocean. The last mission to the moon was Apollo 17, and this is the crew of Apollo 17, Gene Cernan, Ron Evans, and Jack Schmitt. And as I say, we tried to prepare the astronauts for doing surface work on the moon, doing geology work on the moon. And so we picked training sites here on Earth that were very similar in terrain and makeup to what they were on the moon. And so this is a picture of Jack Schmitt and Gene Cernan going through a training exercise out in Arizona. And these were also suited exercises, and this is them going through a suited exercise here on Earth. Now the next picture is the only launch we've ever seen of a launch from the moon. And we were able to get it because we had the Lunar Rover, which had the television camera, and had the antenna that we could point at the Earth. So when the astronauts completed their work on the surface of the moon, we had them point the antenna at the Earth, and then we pointed the television camera at the lunar module because we wanted to see a liftoff. And so this is the only liftoff that we really have of a liftoff on the moon. And that's the upper stage going on up with the astronauts. And the mission was quite successful, and we brought back a myriad of samples, some excellent samples from the Taurus Littrow landing site that we went to on the moon. It was in the Highlands area, in a valley in the Highlands, and it was a very successful mission. And this is the landing, coming in for a landing on the last flight of Apollo. The Apollo program, as I say, was a very successful one. We flew 9 missions to the moon and landed on 6 of them, and they were all quite successful. And the mission started, of course, in '68 with Walt on Apollo 7, and the last mission was flown in December 1972. And they, as I said, went to a varied number of landing sites. So you can see each of the landing sites was in a different area of the moon. They were all pretty much near the equator of the moon because we didn't have a lot of the energy that would allow us to go further to higher latitudes on the moon. But I think the samples that we have are excellent samples. They're at the Johnson Space Center. Investigators every year look into those samples. They're given those samples to do analysis, and they're still doing analyses on the samples. Each year in the Woodlands, they have a lunar planetary conference, and that has gotten bigger ever since 1969. It's been going on since '69, and it's conducted in March of each year, and it'll be coming up again. It just occurred, really. I think this finished this last March. It'll be coming up again next year. It's a great conference, and for those of you that want to learn more about the evolution of the moon and the planets and the Earth, I would recommend that to you. But if you take a look at from that speech that Kennedy gave in 1961, May 25th, it was 8 years later we were on the moon. And that's a rather amazing feat. And if you go back and look at how was that accomplished, I think there are very, very good lessons that you could learn relative to how it was done in those days. We had good leadership. We had a strong technical organization. We had good young people coming up from our colleges that would go into the program. And our leaders had vision and were able to make decisions. But we stopped flying the space shuttle 8 years ago this coming July. And we have not put an American in orbit in all those 8 years. In this 8-year period, we flew 6 Mercury flights, we flew 10 Gemini flights, and we flew 5 Apollo flights in that same 8-year period. And we have yet to put an American astronaut up into orbit since the space shuttle stopped flying in July of 2011. So as you reflect on where we are today and where we came from, I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned. We were able to make decisions in a timely way, and we delegated decisions, and as I say, we had good leadership, and that's the key to it. We had a program on Apollo where we instituted what we call the Configuration Control Board meeting that was occurring every week on a Friday, and the major participants in the program all had to participate in person. Every senior director at the Johnson Space Center, the presidents of the companies that were involved, from North American Rockwell to Grumman, they all had to be there. And then the individual that was responsible for the system, that system that was being developed, be a NASA individual or a contractor, they both had to make a presentation on what they were proposing. If it was a change or if it was a problem or an issue, they had to identify the issue and the problem. The agenda for the meeting was actually put together every Monday, and I had the responsibility of putting the agenda together and would identify not only changes but problems and issues on the program where we had to really resolve this issue or problem. And we would turn that agenda over to the contractors and to the NASA organization on Monday evening, and they would have until Friday to come up with a recommendation. And on Friday we'd have the meeting. As I say, we'd have the presidents of each of the companies sitting there in Houston and committing the companies, and we had directors of the organizations committing the organizations. And we made the decisions right there on the spot and came out with a decision so everybody knew exactly what we decided and what we were going to do. And I think that enabled us to really to make the decisions in a very timely way. That isn't the way it works now, and the system we have now, the bureaucracy we have now, doesn't allow that kind of an operation. But if we're really going to do something worthwhile and do it on a reasonable time schedule, you need to operate that way. And as I say, we had a very talented workforce, and that made a real difference. And the leadership made a real difference. And I'm concerned that as we look to the future, that unless we somehow reestablish some of those very basic concepts that we had in Apollo and were able to do it that way, we're not going to be successful. The Vice President last week said we're going to go to the moon by 2024. There is no way you're going to go to the moon by 2024. There's no way they don't even have a way to get to the moon by 2024. They don't have a way to get to the moon by 2029. They have what they call a Lunar Gateway that they've never costed out, that is probably prohibitively costly. And it's a program that is a space station that orbits a space station. The moon is a God-given space station, and why in the world you'd build a space station to orbit it, Lord only knows. But if you're going to go to the moon and land on the moon and establish some residence on the moon and scientific stations on the moon. But don't go and put a station to orbit the moon. But you need to really look at what we need to do in the future and do it in a reasonable way. And when you do something, build on the foundation of what you've done. The people that gave us the Apollo program and enabled us to land on the moon by the end of the decade decided that really the way to go was land a vehicle on a runway, and they came up with a space shuttle. That's who came up with the shuttle. And the shuttle served us well through 30 years. Now we're building 3 capsules, and none of those 3 capsules are as good as the capsule that Walt flew back in October of 1968. And yet we're building them, and the government's paying for them. Boeing's building one, SpaceX building one, Lockheed Martin building one. They don't have any capability to do EVA. You couldn't build another space station in Earth orbit because there's no way to do construction in Earth orbit with the systems we have now. So as you look at where we want to go, as I say, you need to build on what you have. Right now, the Department of Defense is flying a small vehicle like a shuttle, landing on a runway. It's flown at least 5 or 6 times successfully, and is proven to be a great vehicle. Why can't you really scale that up and you'd have another shuttle that would probably be a better shuttle than the one we had? But you need to consider all these things and really focus on building where you are, or building on what you have, and get back to where we started, because there was a great program, as Walt can tell you, and great times, and I think we were fortunate to be able to work on it. So thank you all.
Okay, who wants to be first? There we go. I'm going to defer to the younger member, and then I'll come right to you. There you go, sir. Don't be scared, I'm not going to bite. Just talk into that so we can... You're being recorded and sent all over.
Okay.
What are you going to ask?
Just wanted to ask, when it got struck by lightning, do you know if the astronauts ever like freaked out or anything? Like they were like.
David, what was that?
So what's your name? Rocco. Basically, we saw the picture of the lightning.
You're breaking up.
Sorry, the picture of the lightning hitting the Saturn V on, I guess it was Apollo 12.
Yes.
He asked if the astronauts ever freaked out.
If they what?
If they freaked out.
I think they were a little nervous. But I think they maintained their cool, and once they got the power back and everything working, they were ready to go on.
Thanks, Rocco.
Okay, my question is more boring. The day that you found out President Nixon canceled the program, what did you think that day?
So when President Nixon canceled the Apollo program.
Pardon?
When President Nixon canceled the Apollo program, what did you think that day when that announcement came out?
Okay.
Where they were deciding not to do an Apollo 18?
Well, I didn't hear you.
When canceled the Apollo
Yes.
program, what did you think that day?
What, when the lightning hit?
When Nixon canceled the Apollo program, what did you think that day?
They canceled it?
Yeah.
I was not very happy with it. But in those days, at the same time we were flying Apollo 17 ended in December of 1972. And 5 months later, we flew Skylab, which was under development as we flew Apollo. So at the same time Apollo was being flown, we already had under development Skylab, which was the nation's first real space station, which was the upper stage of a Saturn IV, of a Saturn V, the S4B. And that mission and the Space Skylab was flown in May of 1973, 5 months later. So there was not a time where you could really, you certainly were sorry to see Apollo ended, and a lot of people were sad about that. They laid off a lot of people around the country because of the end of the program. But at the same time, we also had the space shuttle under development. In July of 1972, we were working on the space shuttle. Actually, that contract got underway in July of '71. And so we had Skylab being flown in 5 months, and then we had shuttle going on. And we also had at that point in time a program to fly with our Russian colleagues, Apollo Soyuz. So that was a great thing about that time. It wasn't just one program. You had Skylab, you had shuttle, you had Apollo Soyuz. So there was a lot going on. Unfortunately today, that isn't the case. And we were progressing, at least we thought we were progressing forward at a good rate.
So Walt, you can ask a question as long as you don't freak out.
Actually, I did not want to necessarily ask a question. I just wanted to tell you, how wonderful it is to see somebody with your experience for so many years to be so candid and honest.
Back in 2016, I did a study on the number of highly cited researchers per organization, and I found that NASA, which is one of our key organizations, was one of the organizations that fell by the most number of highly cited researchers from the period of 2001 to 2014. So, as I was looking at it, the reason that is so is because of the fact that NASA does not have a PhD program. So is it a possibility that NASA can establish a PhD program? That way, young researchers would be interested in joining the fields, especially in areas such as chemistry, physics, material science, nanotechnology, and biochemistry. NASA would help as a key organization in order to kind of boost our national morale and to also enhance the drive for collaborative research.
So George, I'm not sure how much of that you heard, but the basic question is, NASA as an institution used to produce lots of peer-reviewed research, and the study that this young gentleman undertook suggested that between 2001 and 2014, that productivity in scientific papers dropped off. And he's asking if there was a possibility that NASA might develop essentially a PhD program that would help bring up with all these different scientific and technical areas that the space program needs, if NASA has thought about those kind of conditions or those kind of opportunities for young people.
I think there is a postdoc program that NASA is involved in, both for science and engineering. And so there is a great opportunity to come work with NASA leading up to your PhD, and even as after you get your PhD as a postdoc. In addition to that, I think one of the great programs NASA has is a co-op program, the co-op education program, where you can actually, as you're going to school, you can take a semester off and work for NASA and work as an engineer or a scientist or in your discipline. And you go back to school, and it takes you a little longer to finish school, but it gives you an opportunity to really see what the work is like before you commit yourself to a degree in a certain area. And also you can get a great feel for what the work is like, and then if you decide that is what you want to do, NASA usually hires the top co-ops, and they come to work for NASA, and that's been a great source for NASA for young engineers. Unfortunately, here at Rice, we don't have that program, but David assures me they're going to get it started one of these days.
I've been trying for 15 years or so. One comment I would like to make about that. One of the things that NASA takes a lot of hits for a lot of the wrong reasons. Sometimes because they're looked at in certain ways, but I don't doubt your study that things that are peer-reviewed research coming out of NASA may have dropped. But 90% of the papers I've written were funded by NASA. And I can talk for many of my colleagues around the room, the papers that are being written by students at universities across the country and actually across the world are supported either by NASA dollars if they're United States or by NASA collaboration and NASA partnerships. And I don't think NASA gets enough credit for what they do overall. And I think that's important for not just us, but our elected representatives to actually realize that. And you go to any NASA center around the country and have a visit, I'm just astounded by the kind of stuff that's done and the people there that are working. I have to say that because some of them are in the room, but it really is quite phenomenal. And I think we underestimate, people think like if there's a NASA center in the state, then that's a NASA state. But every state in this country has got major millions of dollars of NASA-funded research and development. And I think that's not something that they get enough appreciation for. So. Well, we do acknowledge our sources of funding. I don't know if many of the research tools like WebEx and stuff acknowledge that. They just go for authors and citations and things like that. But again, your point is good. There is a lot of excitement of the young generation in what NASA does, and NASA, I think, overall does a great job. There are various programs that work that, but I think people like myself and my colleagues need to maybe do more to acknowledge where that help comes from, rather than just putting a little byline at the end of a paper. So I think that's an important point. I think that's a fair comment. I think that's a fair comment. Okay, come back to you.
George, what would be your vision of the footprint for the next 30 years in space, and how could we do that with our global partners? How would we need to collaborate to do that like we did with Space Station?
So next 30 years, what's your vision for that, and how do we bring in our global partners?
What?
For the next 30 years, what's your idea of what we should be doing in the next 30 years, and how do we bring in our international partners?
Well, I think the great thing that has happened to the space program, when we started out, it turned out to be a competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. And I think it's evolved now where it's a program where we cooperate with other countries. And I think that's the great thing about Space Station that's flying over us right now, that many nations are involved in the program. And so I think as we look to go back to the moon, I think we need to do that under American leadership, but we need to cooperate with these other countries around the world as we do on Space Station. And I think we can get back to the moon, I think, in a reasonable time if we do it the right way. There are some boosters that are available through SpaceX and Blue Origin that aren't NASA boosters, yet they're very capable. And we need to look at using those capabilities, and I think we can come up with an architecture and a plan that would take us back to the moon. And I think, as I say, I think we need to look at doing it cooperatively, and I'm hopeful that a program like that will evolve.
Yeah, we have a question from online, although I think your last answer, I think maybe has answered part of this. This is from Drew online. He says, what do you say to motivate those at NASA today? your message appears to be NASA's not doing anything and not going anywhere, and you might as well not try. Is that your view as an astronaut maker?
No, I think that we're doing some great things and doing great things with Space Station. And Space Station, I think, is a great program, and we're just capitalizing on the Space Station and doing the experiments that we have waited a good bit of time to do. So I think we need to capitalize on Space Station, and it's really the foundation for moving beyond and understanding the effects of long-term gravity on the human body. And Space Station is a great laboratory to do that. Space Station has got a lifetime that is going to go on, I think, for much longer than 2024. So I think it's a great program, and those involved were involved in it. I think it's a great experience for them. And I think if we get involved in some new activities and look at using the X-37, which is that vehicle, the winged vehicle that's flying, I think that would be a great program for young people to work on. And I think we need to look at, again, giving the young people the opportunity to do more. And I'm pleased when I go out to the Johnson Space Center, I look at the control center and I look around, and there are a lot of young people out there, and I think they're doing great things. But they need the leadership, and they need the direction and the vision, and the program that they can go to work on. And that's what's needed. And I think NASA is still a great place to work, and the opportunities there. I just think that we need to make sure we got the leadership that gives them that opportunity.
So I think we have time for a couple more questions, or maybe 3 questions. There's one here.
Thank you. Hi, George. First of all, I want to commend you. You appear to have spoken for more than an hour and maybe and a half without notes. I can't do it for 5 minutes. So I wanted to ask Pete Conrad of Apollo 12, he and his crew apparently retrieved a piece of equipment off of some that had been left on the moon. The purpose was to determine whether there had been any deterioration or what have you to that equipment. I've never read what the results were.
What was that? Yeah. Yes. Yes, it was. There was analyzed, but I haven't seen the report.
He said he hadn't seen a report. It wasn't analyzed. He never saw
it. I'm sure if you Google, you probably find that report somewhere in the NASA archives.
So I've noticed throughout your conversation that you have not mentioned the Orion program. How do you feel about the Orion program now after Constellation kind of hacked it to small pieces?
Can you comment on your thoughts about the current state of the Orion program?
Well, if you're going to develop a spacecraft, you want it to do something and have some capability. And the amount of money that they invested in Orion is not going to give you much capability. So, and it's a very heavy spacecraft, and it's not going to fly for a long time. And they have weight problems, and if you get it up too high, when you impact into the ocean, which it will if it flies, it can impact at a pretty good rate of descent. On Apollo, we had a command module that we had a goal of when we started out to make it 8,500 pounds. And when we flew, it weighed 12,500 pounds. And it was a very capable command module. I think Walt would attest to that. And I'm looking at the money that we're putting in Orion, and I really wonder, is it really worth it?
Hi, so I'm a current intern at JSC working on the Deep Space Gateway. I won't argue with you about the merits of that, but what advice do you have to young adults such as myself that aspire to join the agency and help get humans back to the moon and beyond?
What was that, Pat?
He's working on Gateway. What advice do you have for young people that
I'd go to work, I'd go back, I'd see if I could go on space station. As I've advised, I think I've advised another individual here to do that same thing.
George, I have a question. How about women in space, specifically about solar rides? Solar rides, and how about women in space? Women in space.
There is a lot of women in space.
What about solar rides? She was the first one. What's your experience?
There are women in space now. Yeah. I think that's a great thing.
Right. So I would point out that one of the reasons there's so many women.
I think the great thing about the program today, another very good thing, is if you go out and look at the control center today, probably the majority of the women majority of the people in the control center and on the consoles are women. And if you look at back in Apollo, I don't think you'll see a woman there. And so women are playing an increasingly important role in the program, and I think that's great. I think that's been a very good thing, not only with us as astronauts, but also engineers and scientists, and they've contributed a lot to what we've been doing.
Again, as I was saying, I think a lot of the credit for how many women are involved in the space program goes down to the gentleman in front of you, actually. So. So I saw another hand up there, but it seems to have gone down. So I think Walt is going to sort of finish with the last comment here. Thank you.
I didn't realize I was making the last comment. But I will say this. I see one of the problems is how broad. Okay, I see one of the problems is how much NASA has broadened itself out. Back in the 1960s, they were focused on what the objective was. Over the years, the last 50 years, they've also moved a lot towards various social activities on it. Now, those are good things to have to be done, but that's not the most efficient way to do it. And while the budget has stayed, well, actually, it's been moving down, they have taken on more and more social tactics on it. Another major change I see is back when NASA was raising money to get started, they were opening up centers around the country. Why? Occasionally those centers might be something that they needed. But frequently those centers were opened so they could get the support of the senators and the congressmen in that particular state. And we should be closing out at least half of those things since then and focusing what we're doing on getting the job done, not all these other social things.
So I'm actually going to give George the last word if you want to say one final word before we close out this evening. What message would you give to Walt and everyone else in the room?
Want me to say something?
Yeah.
Well, I just want to thank you all for coming. I think we've had certainly this country's had a great space program, and I was fortunate to be a part of it, and Walt as well. And we were involved in it during some great days, and I just hope that we can return and make it great again. And I'm hopeful that we will. And I think it's going to take a lot of effort, but I think it can be done, and I'm very hopeful it will be done. So God bless you all.